As long as I've been alive, I've heard it said that music is the gateway to the soul. I've heard it said that there is no art form more personal or with so much potential to emotionally touch an audience than music. The music that we love can live with us for as long as we're alive, and pushes our understanding of the world around us into new territory we might not have thought to explore before. This is a sentiment I wholeheartedly agree with. It's kind of the whole point of my channel. I'm here to share with you the ways that music has affected and impacted me, and in turn, I hope that you'll find music that impacts you. What I don't hear often enough, though, is the idea that said gateway to the soul isn't a one-way connection. For sure, we use music often to discover the parts of ourselves we may not have explored otherwise, but equally important, I think, is the soul of the music itself. Music is a living, breathing creation that changes and shifts and builds relationships that strengthen and weaken over time. Music is a collection of little worlds and civilizations and ecosystems that, by listening, we allow ourselves to enter temporarily and to discover the soul of the piece itself. No genre of music can more consistently prove this to me than ambient can. No genre brings me to tears more often, nothing gives me the same waves of overwhelming emotion. I want to talk today about what ambient music is, what it does, where it comes from, and why you should be listening to it in this new series of genre dives. Let's begin. So, what is ambient music? Well, it's a lot of things, and a lot of very nebulous things at that, but the best way I've heard it described is
music that emphasizes sonics over structure and whose focus is on evoking a particular tone or mood.
these are songs of any length which let go of the stricter boundaries of song construction and instead opt to relish in the landscapes the mind creates for each tone and every sound they implement. Ambient music can be painstakingly designed with every note and texture selected with intent, or it can be more free-flowing and natural, surprising even the artist when they revisit it. The acts of creating and listening to ambient music can be very similar to one another, bringing unique revelations to every party involved, often indescribable besides through the expression of music. A question I hear often is about the difference between ambient music and other minimal genres like drone or minimalism. And what I think is important to note is that none of these genres are mutually exclusive. In fact, one of the fascinating things about ambient music is that it's not really mutually exclusive with any genre. A recording can have ambient influences or elements no matter what type of music it holds primarily. What drone music is, then, is music that is cyclical and repetitive in nature. Songs composed of only one or two repeated elements where the appeal comes in the hypnotic nature, where you come to better understand each loop as it gradually penetrates your mind. There's also minimalism, which is a style of classical music that takes repeated musical fragments and loops them over and over, often falling out of sync gradually and resynchronizing over time. As you can imagine, these genres, while not intrinsically tied to ambient music, pair very well together with it, and some of the most iconic and excellent records the genre has to offer are blends with these genres. Brian Eno, who is generally accepted as the first to coin the term ambient music, describes it as
music that can be actively listened to with attention or as easily ignored, depending on the choice of the listener. It exists on the cusp between melody and texture.
ambient music is, to me, the logical midpoint between music and silence. While Eno's 1978 record, Music for Airports, is widely considered one of the first ambient albums, the genre actually has its roots going much further back, nearly a decade. I would argue that the first ambient albums were created by Popol Vuh in 1970 and 71, but the first ambient song actually has a much weirder story. The story goes that in 1967, a band called Crochet Donut Ring got together and made their first song titled Two Little Ladies. They got signed to Polydor Records and want to release it as a single, but the release is rushed out without a B-side. Nobody would want to purchase only one song, the producer thought, and so in a quick moment of accidental genius, he took the backing track and experimented with a bunch of different layering and tape effects and created the song Nice, which is, to my knowledge, the very first ambient piece. From there, a lot of the genre's evolution took place in the field of krautrock and electronic, with bands like Kraftwerk, Neu, Wendy Carlos, and Tangerine Dream pushing their music into more textural and less structurally defined territory. The aforementioned Popol Vuh really gave it their all in this regard and released Affenstunde at the turn of the decade, their first major release as a group. Affenstunde is absolutely an ambient album by every metric, but it's also a lot of other things. It incorporates more tribal and worldly rhythms and percussion, as well as some really freaky Moog synth work. Popol Vuh was one of the first bands to ever use the synth in proper recording, and it was a move that was absolutely revolutionary for the genre and for music generally, but its newness as a technology really does show in the experimentation on the record. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, but I would never dare call any of it uninteresting. It's their second album, In the Gardens of Pharaoh, that I would consider to be the first true ambient album. There are still rhythmic elements throughout, unquestionably, and the krautrock influences are obviously present, as is some jazz, but the entire album throughout is a lot more texturally consistent and lends itself far more to background enjoyment, whereas the debut demanded attention more often than not. Another early influence on the development of ambient was film scores and soundtracks. The nature of ambient is not to get in the way of whatever else it is you happen to be doing, and so of course for soundtracks it was the perfect fit, where you could still have music playing but not have to worry about it interfering with the dialogue. Popol Vuh were once again important to this, scoring many films including Werner Herzog's Aguirre and Nosferatu. As time would go on, soundtracks would remain one of the most prominent vessels for ambient music, and particularly with the advent and advancement of video game technology, the need for music that can be easily looped and not overly intrusive worked perfectly to the strengths of ambient. As stated before, Brian Eno was one of the biggest influences on ambient going forward, with his 4-part Ambient series officially titling the genre. It might seem like a minor thing at first, but by giving a title to something in a particular movement, you make it real. By saying, yes, this is something, this is happening, and this is something that has not happened before, Eno created ambient. The music existed before, but Eno said, this is what this is, and it stuck. With a core genre now defined, it wasn't long before subgenres started to come about, the first of these being the fairly simple to understand space ambient. Space is a weird sound to evoke, considering sound doesn't even exist in space, but somehow we all know it when we hear it. It's this vast unknown with these long stretches of empty bliss, and it's this subtly aching nostalgia for the childlike wonders that lie amongst the stars. Space could sound like anything, but this is what we chose. Arctic ambient is a pretty similar idea, with the main difference being that we know what the Arctic and Antarctic circles sound like, or at least have the potential to. Arctic ambient doesn't necessarily sound exactly like howling winds and crumbling ice though. Instead, it follows a pretty simple but effective logic. Things that are cold move slower than things that aren't. Notes drone longer before moving, and the experience is often one of frigid isolation. From there, the genre grew into dark and tribal ambient, the former taking the blissful atmosphere and tainting it with a sense of dread and fear, and the latter bringing back those drums from Popol Vuh's earlier work and incorporating them more seamlessly into the ambient that we know today. Eventually, these two genres gave way to ritual ambient, which is pretty much a clear combination of the two. As music outside ambient evolved, we started seeing fusions with genres that didn't exist when it began, particularly black metal and harsh noise. Ambient noise wall is fairly straightforward, being ambient music that is heavily distorted, filling up every crevice with feedback while still maintaining just enough atmosphere that it can still be stimulating to both follow intently and let rest in the background. Black ambient is similar, but instead of pure distortion, you'll often find overdriven guitars, shrieked vocals, or groaning whispers. For lighter fusions, there's also ambient pop and Americana. Ambient pop is a very broad genre, ranging from ambient music with vocals to pop music without any structure, but in general, you'll know it when you hear it. Ambient Americana, on the other hand, is a lot easier to define, being ambient music that uses more rootsy American instruments like steel guitar and harmonica to build its atmosphere. Even the straight-up normal ambient of today sounds wildly different than it did in the 70s and 80s, thanks in large part to advancements in recording and production technology. There are very few textures an artist can't replicate either digitally or acoustically, and these days, all it comes down to is the will of the artist to push boundaries and discover new soundscapes to capture. With this history under our belt, let's talk about some important albums. First off, let's get some classics out of the way, and of course we can start with Brian Eno's seminal ambient quadrilogy. Music for Airports was my first love in the genre, and that's probably the case for a lot of people. The soothing tones of synthesizer and electric piano lulling the listener into a trance-like state unlike anything else, and flawlessly replicating the feeling of being in a brightly lit airport waiting for your flight right as the sun is rising. I'm even enamored with the choral tracks that a lot of people seem to dislike for some reason. I think they lend the sense of nostalgia that the album really thrives on. From there, we have the Plateau of Mirrors, which, honestly, I think these days, I might like it more than Airports. There's something so enrapturing about Harold Budd's piano compositions and playing mixed with Eno's uniquely spacious but deliberate style of production. I think it's the perfect encapsulation of his mission statement for the genre of being just as effective for active listening as it is for background noise. And then there's Day of Radiance, which is kind of the black sheep of the herd. It's not actually made by Brian Eno, technically. Instead, it's written and performed by dulcimer and zither player and experimental melodist Laraji. These two stringed instruments form the basis for nearly every sound across this record, and while many do find their sharper tones to be grating, I find the way that Eno produces them to have a very soothing effect on me, in particular on the meditation half of the record. And finally, there's On Land, which is probably the most distinct record in the series sonically, not because of any instrument choice like on Radiance, but because of the lack altogether. There's a lot more people credited on this album than the other three, and nearly all of them are credited only as sound engineer, with only a couple of moments across the album where you could definitively say, this is an instrumental performance. It's the darkest album in the series by far, and evokes imagery far more intense than the relaxed previous installments ever did, hinting at where Eno would take his sound next. And where Eno took it next was to the far reaches of space for what may be his greatest ambient achievement. Apollo, Atmospheres, and Soundtracks is a genuine triumph of the birthing genre, effectively capturing the absolute scale and unknowable emptiness of outer space, through a lens of nostalgic wonder mixed with a slight hint of dread and trepidation. It's hard not to imagine oneself floating aimlessly in an escape pod, waiting for a rescue that is definitely coming, you just don't know when. The mind races imagining the possibilities that might lie on planets incomprehensibly far away, and not a second of time is wasted in bringing those thoughts to life. Eno was far from the pioneer of space ambient, though, and while I do think he perfected it, the 70s and 80s were rife with excellent portraits of worlds beyond the stars. Among these is Klaus Schulze, who, while also pioneering the Berlin School movement with his band Tangerine Dream, was prolific in the 70s, creating some of the earliest examples of space ambient with his iconic layered synthesizers and organs. Some of these pieces waver in and out of ambient, bringing elements of progressive electronic and drones in, among other things, but at the core it's still there, and I think there's no better example of it than his first album, Irrlicht. At times it's grandiose and brings to mind imagery of War of the Worlds style alien invasions. Others, it's like wandering the halls of an abandoned space station, searching for a hint of life among retro-futuristic panels and dim red light. His double album, Cyborg, on the other hand, takes a more introspective approach to space ambient, feeling at times like the drones and noises are trying to pierce into your skull and take you over. It cycles like machinery and sometimes feels like the soundtrack to a hypnosis scene in an old horror movie, moving in cycles across its nearly 100-minute runtime. I would not consider Tangerine Dream to be a band who makes ambient music, but it's pretty obvious to me that 1972's Zeit absolutely is. The first disc's synths feel industrial and man-made, like it's man's first vessel into the deeper unknown, but there's also a hint of, dare I say, divine intervention. There's a story being told through this audio that almost pushes it out of ambient territory just by how engaging it is, but long and droning passages and ethereal soundscapes let it remain firmly in that territory. The second disc, in contrast to the first, is organic and alien. If the first disc's spaceship is made of iron and rusting machinery, the second's is made of living, breathing organisms. They wobble and bend as they navigate the abyss effortlessly without fear of the consequences that the human vessel needs to account for. And then there's Steve Roach, possibly the most hopeful of all. Structures from Silence is probably the quintessential space ambient album in my view, each note resonating like a shimmering star being birthed a million light years away, dead before its shine even reaches your eyes, but beautiful nonetheless. There's an optimistic bent to this record, which compels me even more so than the waxing nostalgia of Apollo or the oppressive aliens of Schulze. Space is a place we can and will go, so says the music, and that's a beautiful thing. Meanwhile, in Japan, the name to beat in the 80s was Hiroshi Yoshimura. His 1982 album, Music for 9 Postcards, is quite possibly my favorite ambient album ever made, and trust me, I've had to listen to a lot of them for this video. There's something so arresting and soothing about the way he juxtaposed the low, organ-like drones of the electric piano with its sharper and more whimsical high notes. The influence on a certain soundtrack is palpable here, and the peaceful mood it instills in the listener is indescribable. I have gotten teary-eyed listening to this album, but I don't think it's possible to be sad while listening to it. Instead, the emotion is one of blissful release and contemplation. Yoshimura wrote in the liner notes that he was inspired by
the movements of clouds, the shade of a tree in summertime, the sound of rain, the snow in a town.
Yoshimura's other and most known album from this period, Green, is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a vibrant and verdant atmosphere built through growing repetitions of short synth lines. The sound is more evolved and clearly influenced hundreds of game soundtracks to come, and while I definitely prefer his first album, this is a record just as deserving of its classic status. From here, we can move on to what I consider to be the golden era of ambient, that being the 90s to the 2000s. This is when many of the big names I haven't mentioned yet got their starts, including none other than Richard D. James himself, Aphex Twin. Now, I made the executive decision not to dive into ambient techno or house for this video because that would result in me getting pulled down way too many rabbit holes to count. That said, I can't ignore the importance of Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92. This was by no means the first ambient techno record, not by many years, but it was by far the biggest breakout the genre ever had, and influenced the state of the genre for decades to come. Also, if the title is to be believed, and there's stuff in here from as far back as 1985, that actually would predate basically any ambient techno releases ever. Now, a lot of this stuff is actually far from ambient in nature at all. There's some stuff that just goes obscenely hard, especially towards the middle, but this album isn't often remembered for those. Instead, it's remembered for the excellent chill cuts that open the record, which maintain rhythm and structure throughout, but never force themselves into the forefront. That's all prep work for Saw 2, though, which completely does away with any of the techno elements and dives headfirst into a 2.5-hour behemoth of pure ambiance. According to many, this is the absolute peak of ambient music, and while I can't necessarily agree to it being my personal favorite, it's impossible not to at least sit in awe of the majesty of such a piece. Every single song is nearly perfect, and somehow, despite its length, each song manages to be completely distinct as well, covering all the bases of ambient up to that point. Memorable is not a word I've used all that much to describe individual songs up to this point in the video, and that's by design, but I would be hard-pressed to think of a purely ambient track as memorable as the third track on here, only to have it followed by the sheer terror of track 4. There's something haunted about the mystery box that is this album. With not a single named track, you never know what the next song will hold, and the suspense somehow manages to keep me engaged across the, frankly, ludicrous runtime. His project after this would dive far more into IDM territory, which is where I'm more comfortable, but if nothing else, you can't ignore this album. Right around this time came Global Communications' only full-length album, the aptly titled 76 minutes and 14 seconds. Across the titular runtime, we essentially get a more singular and cohesive evolution of what Aphex Twin started on the first Saw record, with ambient passages acting as the bridge between techno and down-tempo peaks. The moments on here that go hard go crazy hard and can get me pumped up like no other album in the genre, but those highs are only so good because they emerge naturally from the record's sea of ambient synths and choral layers. A year later, we started hearing from one of the most well-known and acclaimed names in the genre, that being Stars of the Lid. Their first few albums are quite good, but I think the group really hit their stride in 1999 with the release of Avec Laudanum, and they maintained that stride for their subsequent 2 albums. Laudanum is by far the most minimal of the 3, with these long, incredibly subtle drones, which are rarely substituted with anything else to break the hypnosis. It's their shortest work by a decent margin, but in that time, the atmosphere and miniature world it creates is unmatched. Then we have their next 2 albums, which, despite both being equally acclaimed and both being equally monumental in length, fill 2 very different needs for me in terms of what ambient can provide. 2001's The Tired Sounds of Stars of the Lid is a record that makes me feel grounded. It carries a very distinct trajectory across its whole runtime, and while the soundscapes are absolutely, unquestionably gorgeous, they also feel earthly and safe. Listening to this album at a high volume is like wrapping yourself in a sonic blanket and basking in the warmth of it. Stars of the Lid and their refinement of the decline, while sonically quite similar, evokes a very different but no less comfortable feeling. Listening to this album in 1 2-hour sitting very distinctly feels like I'm leaving my body, if only briefly, and gaining a sense of perspective on my life from a top-down view. It's a feeling of pure mental clarity that I often find myself yearning for without realizing it. When I put on the first track of this thing, it feels like some sort of spirit is taking my hand and gently guiding me away, promising to return me safely when the record is over. Back in the physical world, though, the 90s also saw the start of Germany's own Gas, an artist whose aesthetic takes the form of trees and greenery in almost every instance. This is music for nature, and while it started out as more ambient techno than straight ambient, the approach was very different to instances we've talked about before. Rather than the complex and intricate rhythms and patterns a la Aphex Twin, we're treated to steady, four-on-the-floor dance beats that wouldn't sound out of place in a German nightclub. The reason this manages to work in the form of ambient, however, is that they are totally buried in what seems like a dozen layers of ambient strings and other sounds. Prevalent vinyl crackle sounds more like a campfire burning, and it all comes together in this completely unique package unlike anything I've ever heard. It's really 2000s pop that solidifies Gas as an essential artist in the scene, though. Gone for the most part are the throbbing techno bass hits, only appearing in very specific situations, and instead, they're replaced with the sounds of nature. Birds sing, insects chirp, rodents call to each other. Nature is no longer simply the driving creative force behind the album, though it still is definitely that, but it's also a core tenet of the actual musical work. It's music that makes me wish I could go outside more often. Not outside in shitty suburban sprawl, but actual outside with nature and life and... Man, honestly, the longer I live, the more of this planet I watch our species decimate, the more heart-wrenching this album becomes, because honestly, it's only so long before the sounds that this album uses start to become rarer and rarer to naturally hear, and that keeps me up at night. The turn of the millennium is when we got our first glance at who would ultimately turn out to be one of the biggest names in modern ambient, that being Tim Hecker. I could do a whole video on his discography, and frankly, I might, but for now, I just want to talk about a few key projects. His first, titled Haunt Me Do It Again, is a bold step into the scene which blends buzzing drone with soothing pianos to create a midway point, like trying to watch a beautiful vista through the gaps in a snowstorm. Slight hints of glitchy electronics harken back to his previous moniker of Jet One, but they take such a backseat to the soft hiss of static and the all-consuming tones that it feels more like fleeting memories of music long gone. The static hiss is what defined Hecker's next project, Radio Amore. If it represented the isolation of a snowstorm before, here it is the literal radio static implied by the title. Sounds and song fragments drift across the airwaves, forgotten until someone tunes into them, lost and shattered memories of music and radio broadcasted to no audience, collected and preserved in a complex rumination on the nature of sound itself. It's this rumination that leads us to Harmony in Ultraviolet, which is my personal favorite Tim Hecker album. Using the first half to build investment in the listener with its beautiful and slightly unnerving soundscapes, the second half gradually reveals the true weight of what's being done here, climaxing in what could be argued as the greatest moment in ambient music history, that being Whitecaps of White Noise. I dare not spoil the experience, but this is a truly special album. Hecker's most famous work, Rave Death 1972, does the exact opposite. Instead of building up to a gratifying conclusion, the listener is forced to bear witness as the music disintegrates until nothing is left. Everything collapses, and there is nothing to do but watch as that which you love shatters, then crumbles, then blows away in the wind. Sense of collapse is not an uncommon trope in ambient music, and nobody showed it better than William Basinski on his Disintegration Loops series. I won't go into the story behind these records here because it's not very relevant to the video, but the music itself does something very unique in the medium at the time by taking short tape loops and repeating them over and over and over and over for dozens of minutes on end, wearing them down until there's nothing left. The tape literally disintegrates before our very ears, and I think every listener will come away from these with a different interpretation of what that means to them. And now we reach the 2010s. I personally think that these years will go on to mark a tide shift in ambient music, as it began blending with many more genres than it previously had. As the hardware and software became more and more readily available, it also allowed for more music than ever before, both in and out of ambient. The main one I'd like to focus on here, however, is Vaporwave, and how Ambient took that and ran with it. It all began with Replica by Oneohtrix Point Never. At least that's how I see it. Taking the previously tread ground of Plunderphonics, which I've got a whole video on, and toning the energy down, focusing on the atmosphere these compiled samples could elicit, Replica feels like the musical equivalent of a lucid dream. You know that thing where apparently every single person you see in your dreams is some stranger you've seen before because your brain can't make up faces from nothing? This is like the musical equivalent of that. You can't truly make new music, only compile ideas had before, and it's the way you choose to arrange those ideas that makes it special. Other artists took this same concept and ran with it. From Telepath to Virtual Dream Plaza to Mindspring Memories, each artist brought their own flavor to the fusion, often informed by their previous Vaporwave works. For me, though, the obvious standout has always been 2814 and their 2015 album Birth of a New Day. I don't think there's a more cyberpunk album than this one. It takes influence from Vangelis's fantastic and seminal Blade Runner score for sure, but by pushing further into ambient and greatly basing their atmosphere on the amazing album cover art by Kidmograph, they've made something even more special in my opinion. It's an album for walking at night through the city after a storm, taking note of every light source and tracking how it reflects off the various shiny surfaces. The cars that drive by splashing through the puddles become a part of the musical experience. The people who walk by, talking loudly to each other about things you'll never get the context for, those become part of the music too. Birth of a New Day is a living album, changed and given purpose by the world you bring it with you to. But what about a dying album? An album that seems to forget itself as it progresses. Leyland Kirby has been making music under the moniker of The Caretaker since the late 90s, but it wasn't until 2011's An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, and later his 6-part series Everywhere at the End of Time, that he truly began making a name for himself. Both stretch the definition of ambient for this video, but I feel like I would be doing a disservice to the past decade of ambient to ignore them. At its core, An Empty Bliss is an album about dementia and the slow decay of memory that comes with it. By sampling old Dixieland jazz and slowly letting the record seemingly rot away as the music goes on, it evokes the feeling of sad nostalgia as you begin to forget the things you used to hold so close to you. An Empty Bliss was great and got its fair share of attention on release, but it's Everywhere at the End of Time which took that concept and truly made good on it. Rather than simply documenting the final moments of a dementia patient's life, Everywhere at the End of Time expands the scope and portrays the entire process, from pre-diagnosis to the eventual end. The final product is over 6 hours of music, but by splitting the releases up across 3 years, it made it not only more manageable, but allowed the listener to kind of follow this journey in real time. It let us build an attachment, and even though we all knew where it was going, it didn't make it any less difficult to stomach when that final stage finally came. And I think that leads us cleanly into dark ambient, which we've talked a bit about, but haven't really given its due, considering how big of a deal it is, really. The genre has been around forever, with Lustmord's Heresy and Roger Rich's collab Stalker, but I think the very best the genre has to offer has been achieved in the past 15 years or so, be it the Garo Gary Gegege's Moanai High or Krang's monolithic beast of an album Works for Abattoir Fermé. You don't have to dig very hard to find scary, haunting album experiences these days, especially if you're willing to blend it with other, quote, scary genres. Black metal and ambient have been joined at the hip for a long time. Even in the 90s, an artist who shall not be named included a 25-minute ambient piece in his black metal opus. Over time, however, these ambient elements have escaped the realm of single tracks and started to bleed into the black metal songs themselves. Fantastic recent examples of this include Tra's last few records, as well as the elusive RH07 by an unknown artist. But my personal favorite is Murmure's self-titled from 2010. The way that feedback blends with the more traditionally lush soundscapes, sometimes eschewing the need for guitars entirely, makes for one of the most unique and entrancing black metal albums of all time. Ambient and industrial have an even more interlaced history. The quote-unquote biggest industrial band, Nine Inch Nails, have been making ambient music for a long time, be it for scores or even full albums of it themselves. But beyond that, Coil, a band I will be talking about soon enough, have been using ambient arguably since their pure industrial days, and definitely have used it plenty of times since. Over time, as industrial started to branch off into subgenres, we also started to hear death industrial music, and this is where dark ambient truly finds its home. The best example of this, to me, is the way that the artist Euboa finds these little gaps between the pain and noise to build these equally horrifying bits of atmosphere, as well as bits of calm between the storm of chaos. Chaos is a great way to enter the final Tim Hecker album I want to talk about today, that being 2013's Virgins. It's a sequel to Rave Death in a lot of ways, but by incorporating more electroacoustic and drone elements, the album feels a lot more structured. It's like an old abandoned house. It's definitely haunted, but maybe not in a scary way, just in a very matter-of-fact way, where there's definitely spirits here, and you can't see them, and they can't hurt you, but there's someone in this home that doesn't exist anymore. Is it sad? Is it scary? Is it mundane? Exciting? It's up to your own relationship with both the album and the ghosts that live within it. That brings me to the last artist who helped define the genre-bending possibilities of modern ambient, and that's Grouper. Grouper stands out in particular to me as one of the few ambient artists who isn't shy to apply her own vocals liberally across her soundscapes, acting as an angelic guide through the open void she paints on Alien Observer, or the dreamscapes on Dream Loss, or the misty woods on Dragging a Dead Deer Up a Hill. The words bleed in and out of focus like a smudged camera lens trying repeatedly to focus on a human face, but only being able to capture the environment the subject inhabits. And finally, let's do a lightning round of sorts with some awesome ambient soundtracks to round us out. Most of these are for video games because, frankly, I think that's where most of the best soundtracks come from anyways, and we'll start with Minecraft. This one was obvious. Despite apparently not really ever setting out to make, quote, ambient music proper, C418 managed to make two of the best ambient soundtracks ever. They perfectly fit into the game, fading in and out in perfect time to whatever it is you happen to be doing. The music builds and terraforms itself alongside the player and makes what could have been a mundane or boring act into a genuinely emotional experience. As a standalone, it works just as well, with the vinyl abridged versions of both volumes acting as the very best way to experience the music. Hollow Knight is a game I could sing the praises of for years to come, with its amazing exploration, surprisingly engaging combat, and a mood unlike any other game I've played, barring perhaps Dark Souls. That mood is facilitated in large part thanks to the fantastic score that accompanies your exploration, be it the sweeping chorals that underpin the piano melodies of City of Tears, or the soothing harps of Green Path, or the shimmering gleam that accompanies the Crystal Peak. Not a moment of the game goes unscored, and it results in some of the most diverse ambient music, and otherwise, ever. A little bit of a shocker for me when the game came out was Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild's score. Most of the games have had, or at least had facsimiles of, sweeping orchestral soundtracks with big melodic hooks that rest in the player's mind for years to come. Breath of the Wild's soundtrack still sits in the back of my mind, but for a very different reason. It's largely comprised of very sparse keys that play seemingly at random. Even the battle music largely is borderline random notes, and yet somehow, it all works to portray the vast emptiness that is post-apocalyptic Hyrule. A very bold move in a game full of bold moves. I've yet to play the new game, Tears of the Kingdom, but I'm looking forward to seeing if the same soundtrack ideas hold true. I'll even take a moment to shout out the non-game gaming examples of ambient that I've probably spent the most time listening to, period, and that is the PlayStation background menu music. Genuinely one of the best examples of pure ambient music out there, be it the sweeping waves of the PS2 menu, the somber keys of the PS4, or the twinkling PS5 music, which, despite having the system since launch, I literally only just realized actually has a really subtle beat playing under certain parts of it. All of it is music I'm incredibly nostalgic for, but it also acts as essentially flawless ambient music in its own right. Moving away from games temporarily, the anime film Akira's soundtrack holds a special place in my heart for being possibly my favorite example of tribal ambient. It's a genre I didn't talk about too much before, but it's mostly because I wanted to save it for this soundtrack. The tribal drum patterns add so much to not just the music independently, leading a borderline hypnotic feel to them, but also the very bizarre nature of the film itself. On the television front, I have to talk about the absolute classic that is the Twin Peaks original soundtrack by Angelo Badalamenti. It's not solely ambient, often delving into the territory of loungy jazz, but the ambient moments such as Laura Palmer's theme and Nightlife stand out to this day as some of the more fitting uses of the genre in cinema, helping to build that all-important tone to David Lynch's masterpiece. And speaking of all-important tone, how could I not close by talking about my all-time favorite soundtrack, Silent Hill 2? While it touches on a lot of bases, from straight-up rock to industrial, the ambient tracks are really what makes Silent Hill 2 so special. They're what you hear most often in the game, and they make for one of my favorite ambient records ever, even if you cut all the equally fantastic non-ambient songs. The soundtrack is also painstakingly crafted to be a perfect front-to-back album experience, even without having played the game, so there's literally no excuse not to go listen to it. So, at the end of everything, what is ambient? Well, there's a few definitions that we've gone through today, but at the end of it all, in the simplest terms possible, it's background music. There's a stigma around the term background music sometimes, but I think we all know it's something we need in our lives from time to time. I hope that this guide to the genre has been helpful and entertaining. If you want to see more of these, let me know, and give me some ideas for what other genres have rich and interesting histories that you'd like to see me cover next. This was by far the most time investment I put into a project, but I really think it paid off, and I'm hopeful that you all enjoyed it as much as I do. Shout out, of course, to all my friends who are supporting me over on patreon.com. It's been a hectic couple months with me moving out for the first time and traveling more than I ever have before, so the support is more helpful than ever right now. If you want to hear more from me, I have made my debut as the third co-host on the Modulation podcast recently, which you can find on your streaming service of choice, as well as on the website modulat.io. Special thanks to my good friends HotCyder and Jacob Geller for reading quotes, as well as my partner for defining ambient music in the beginning of the video. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you soon.